Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm your host, Jared Zimmer, and as always, we have with us Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, so good to see you again.
Jared, it's always a joy to be on with you.
Well, you recently posted on Facebook a video of our film crew overseas getting footage for the second part of the Pivotal Player series. Can you let us know where they'll be traveling and perhaps a few of the saints they'll be focusing on?
Yeah, I'm very proud of that gang. The way we do it now is the crew goes over before I go, and they get what they call the B-roll. That's the term for all the attendant photography. So we're filming this summer for the Augustine episode and the Benedict episode. So the most recent trip, they were in Switzerland and France for the most part. And they were filming largely in Benedictine houses. Because in the episode, what I do is we talk about Benedict's life and times. But then we talk about the rule. And we thought, why not, as I do that, go to some of the great Benedictine places around Europe and around the world. So they were over in Einsiedeln, which is in Switzerland. It's the mother house of St. Meinrad, if you know that monastery in the States. They were up in the most glorious places in the Catholic world, I think. Mont Saint-Michel off the Normandy coast. They were in Fontenay. They were in Vézelay, different places. So very proud of that group, and they sent back some beautiful little films of what they were capturing. And then I'll go over with the crew in late July, and we'll do what we call the stand-ups, where I do my, on-camera pieces. And then that whole process gets edited together by our director, Matt Leonard. So it's a long, complicated process, beginning with writing a script, which I did actually last summer for this one. And just now we're getting around to filming.
Well, wonderful. Can't wait to see the final product. So in today's episode, we're going to continue our discussion regarding the 8 principles of the Word on Fire movement. Really the pillars of the lifestyle by which we at Word on Fire live. In the last episode, we discussed our special commitment to new media, the fact that we use the new media as a potent opportunity to reach those who we wouldn't necessarily find in our churches. So following up on that previous discussion, today, Bishop Barron and I are going to discuss the 4th of the 8 principles, which is rootedness in the mystical body of the church. We understand the astonishing power that comes from forging strong relationships with the saints of the church, not only as friends in a close relationship, but really allies on the mission to evangelize the unaffiliated. We might call these individuals heroes, really, of the new evangelization. So, Bishop, one reason the stories and the intercession of saints are so powerful is their incredible witness of the faith that they profess for us. How is it and why is it that they're just so powerful?
Well, this whole idea of the mystical body is one that I have always found compelling. Go back now the years before Vatican II, the best and brightest people in the Catholic world, from Romano Guardini to Karl Adam to Godfrey Diekman in our country, and Virgil Michael, many others, Reinhold Hildenbrand, one of my heroes, the rector of Mundelein. They were all using the language of the mystical body. And then that came to fruition in Pius XII's wonderful encyclical called Mystici Corporis on the mystical body. I think in many ways the best of the theological and liturgical movements that go right back to the 19th century, the so-called Tübingen school. Now we're getting a little bit technical, but in Germany in the early to mid-19th century, this school emerged. And Matthias Joseph Scheben was one of the great advocates of this by the mid to late 19th century. And then Scheben's thought comes up in the thought of the people I just mentioned. And then it reaches a kind of flowering at Mystici Corporis by Pius XII. Well, then, see, all of that powerfully informs Vatican II. And once you look at those documents under that rubric, they open up in a whole new way. I might suggest you go back and reread the Vatican II documents, but under the rubric of the mystical body, right? That the church is not an organization, it's an organism. We are cells and molecules and organs in a mystical body. Now listen, that stretches across space, that's true. So I'm connected to you by baptism. I'm connected to everyone on the planet baptized. But it also stretches across time. It stretches back through the centuries because the saints are also members of this mystical body, and I'm connected to them through faith, hope, and love. That idea, I think, is very powerful, and it's a very pregnant idea. It gives rise to life in all sorts of ways. It informs our sacramental theology. It informs our pastoral ministry. It informs our evangelization. Read now Karl Wojtyła and Joseph Ratzinger, right? John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Their writings are filled with the mystical body idea. Now read one of my great theological heroes, Hans Urs von Balthasar. The saints are the true theologians, right? It's by the saints, these members of the mystical body who have come to sort of a fulfillment, that we learn what it means to be a Christian and how to think as a Christian. So all of that I inherited when I was a young guy and reading all these people and always found compelling. And so I bring it to the fore now in our movement.
And I think a great strategy for our listeners to be aware of when it comes to the stories of the saints and perhaps in their desire to evangelize is to see the power that they have just purely on the story itself. So, for example, I used to work at a parish here in Texas, and we would have individuals come in that weren't Catholic, and they would be there with their boxing gloves on, ready to apologetically go back and forth. And of course, I would calmly answer the questions, but I would tend to steer the conversation a little bit and go towards a story of a saint that perhaps this individual might really be able to connect with. So one time I had a soldier, right? And we were going back and forth, and I ended up bringing up Miguel Pro and just talked about his story. And it really lightens the conversation.
Yeah. And someone like Miguel Pro, embodies all the truths that we're talking about apologetically and theologically. Now, it doesn't mean we bypass that. I'm advocating a smart Catholicism. But your instinct is a good one because, okay, look, we can debate this all day, but do you want to see it, what I'm talking about? Look at him. Let me tell you his story because you're going to see in him what I'm talking about. It's like you can talk about basketball abstractly, or you can bring someone to a game and say, hey, watch Steph Curry play. Watch him play. He's instinctually embodying all the principles of basketball, So that's the analogy. And it doesn't mean you don't study basketball or there isn't a moment. We'll do now a football analogy for the X's and O's, right? There is a moment for that when the coach sits down and really plots out the play, and you got to learn that playbook. Talk to any of the great pro football players. I mean, learning that playbook during 2-a-day summer workouts, that's a big part of the process. Nevertheless, look at Walter Payton run, Look at Peyton Manning over the line, Now watch someone that has so embodied the principles of football, who has that playbook in his body, not just in his mind, right? That'd be the analogy now for the saints. Is let's do the X's and O's. Let's do apologetics and theology, and let's have a debate. But, at the end of the day, look at Miguel Pro. He's the Peyton Manning of this, this Christian thing. So I think that's really a good instinct.
Yeah, they're really, sure signs of the incarnational aspect of Christianity. That the fact that we are not a dualistic religion, and we can see it in the body lived out. Well, here at Word on Fire, we have a few saints in particular who we really lean on for intercession. And I thought it might be helpful to go through a few of these saints and why they're so interwoven into our mission as a movement. This way they can come to know them a little better and maybe hear from you why you encourage us all to grow in friendship with them. And of course, the first saint is the little flower, Saint Therese of Lisieux. So can you tell us why she has had such an impact on your life and maybe what message she carries for all of us listening?
Well, of course, first of all, she's one of the patrons of the missionary life of the church. And I love the irony of that, that she was this woman who died at 24 and really never left her little home area, lived in this Carmel, they call them, in Normandy, dies at 24, never having left the walls of it. And yet she's the patroness of the missions. Why? Well, because she felt, first of all, this sort of call to be all things, right? She wanted to be martyr and missionary and doctor and so on. But see, what did she further intuit? She intuited that behind all of those moves is love. So finally she said, I want to be love in the heart of the church. And she taught us what love is. This young girl died at 24, never left her convent walls. But she taught us, don't worry about doing great things. Do little things with great love. And see, when you do that, you're not playing to the world. You're not playing to a worldly audience. You're living the divine life. And that means someone right now listening to me who is in a sickbed can't really do anything in terms of, heroic activity, but can perform the simplest act of love, praying for someone. But doing it with great love hooks you onto the power of God. See? She taught us that. If Word on Fire is doing its work, but not doing it with love, then we're wasting our time. We shouldn't worry about doing great things in the eyes of the world, but of doing the simplest things with great love. That's what she teaches.
It reminds me of a quote from Mother Teresa that said, if you want to change the world, go home and love your family.
Yeah, quite right. No, and that's now you really push the paradox. Don't worry about doing great things, but little things with great love. But actually, when you do the little things with great love, you do in fact have a deeply transformative effect on the world around you. So that's the paradox. But leave that to God. You do what's given to you to do in the present moment. That's what she teaches.
So the next saint then is one who I've told numerous people to go to, yet sometimes they're a little bit hesitant because of the level of theology that he wrote. And I'm, of course, talking about St. Thomas Aquinas, one of your great intellectual mentors. Why ought people go to Thomas, and really what advice might you have for those who are a little hesitant about breaking open his tomes?
Yeah, well, there's a way to get into them. I mean, there's a lot of commentaries and books that are more accessible. I might not recommend for a beginner just to pick up a text of the De Potentia or the Summa or something, because it's a bit like picking up, Einstein's most complicated books. So, but you get to Einstein, get to him, but go through a steady process of acclimation. And there are a lot of ways. Get Peter Kreif's if you want Summa of the Summa. Get my little book on Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master. Get Chesterton's great book on Aquinas. So there are ways into him, but there's no one better in our tradition. Augustine might be a rival, who articulates the intellectual heft, depth, richness of Catholicism than Thomas Aquinas. So I think if you want to engage the questions of our time, I can't think of a better person. We mentioned Fulton Sheen last week. Fulton Sheen at one point in his life said he made sure that every single word that Thomas Aquinas wrote in Latin, in the original, passed under his eyes. So he read, and that's no small thing.
Wow. Yeah.
And he read it in Latin, every single word that Thomas Aquinas wrote. That's every Bible commentary, every Aristotle commentary. That means all the Summae, the commentary and the sentences, everything. Sheen read it all in Latin. So that's a good thing to do.
And I think often when people hear Thomas Aquinas too, they tend to overlook the fact that he was also a model of virtue. I mean, he lived chastity. He lived every virtue possible to its utmost.
Yeah, he was. He was a great saint, not just a great intellectual, and a mystic of the highest order, though that doesn't come through in the writings as readily. He writes in a very almost antiseptic way but he was doing it. He was reading the signs of the times. As the Aristotelian philosophy was coming into the university system, he realized, okay, we got to get in this game. We got to get in this game, and we got to get in at the highest level. If he had continued writing in the more monastic vein, people would have said, it's not serious. He's not engaging the real questions of our time. So it wasn't selling out. It was saying, nope, this is the dominant sort of parlance of the time. So I got to get in there. And in fact, I'm going to outdo them. I'm going to out Aristotle. So that's what Thomas was about. And I think that's a very good instinct up and down the ages.
He's also a prime example of looking at pieces of culture from outside the bubble and seeing what truth might be within it.
Yeah. Oh, no, right. Read Thomas, and you'll find he happily cites Jewish rabbis like Moses Maimonides. He cites Arab philosophers like Avicebron and Avicenna and Averroes. He cites pagan philosophers like Cicero and Aristotle and Plato. He cites Christians of all stripes, even someone like Origen, who was in Thomas's time certainly under suspicion. His view was, hey, wherever truth is, that's an echo of God, and don't hide away in some little cave, reading only people who are flawlessly right on everything. Then you're going to deprive yourself of an awful lot of truth. Thomas reveals an extraordinary breadth of mind and spirit. And I love, too, how he engages his intellectual enemies when he does so, always in the most benign sort of spirit, always giving them the benefit of the doubt, formulating their arguments better than they would. I love the fact, for example, in our time, which is so marked by religious conflict, the fact that he always refers to Maimonides, who's one of the great medieval Jewish philosophers, as Rabbi Moises in his Latin, Rabbi Moses says, always with great respect. That makes Thomas a model.
So our next saint is one I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with, and that's St. John Paul II. This man was perhaps our best vision of what really a Renaissance man is. I mean, he wrote poetry, plays, he was an actor, but yet he was also unbelievably adept to philosophy and theology. He was an athlete. He played a critical role in the fall of the communist regimes. Just an unbelievable man in general. So how is it that this modern saint was able to accomplish so much, and how ought we try to embody that same sense of vigor?
Yeah, he was a man of prayer above all, and that's how I think he did it. The French would use the word surdoué. He was super gifted, as you say, in all these areas. But I think it's grounded in John Paul in prayer and mysticism and poverty. He gave himself at a very early age to Christ, and in the midst of extraordinary suffering. We all know that from George Weigel's great biography and other writings, that in this perhaps greatest trial of the 20th century, this young kid finds himself in the midst of it. And in that, he gave himself to Christ. And I think that's what sustained him all his life through. And then it gave him a unity of vision. So I've used that line from Kierkegaard a lot, that the saint is someone whose life's about one thing. Well, look at the great, variegated life that John Paul lived, but yet the whole thing was about one thing. It was about a living relationship to Christ. So I think that's the key to John Paul. Someone like him comes along once every 500 years. And so it was a privilege of my lifetime that we were living during that period. I've got a picture of him up in my chapel, and so I invoke him in prayer every single day. And I think he's the grandfather of the new evangelization. So everything we're doing is really under his guidance. But I think prayer, Jared, was the key to John Paul.
And he's really just a vision of, Irenaeus' quote about the glory of God as man fully alive. The fact that he really appreciated all of the cultural dynamics that are out there, whether it be sports or poetry or plays or movies or music. He loved it all and said it all has a place in our Catholic faith.
That's right. And there's a blitheness of spirit in John Paul. John Paul could certainly roar with criticisms, as he did against, communism. But his general stance, he's like Thomas Aquinas that way, whom he loved, by the way. He reverenced Aquinas. But there's that kind of openness of spirit about John Paul, and a willingness to go, in his case, literally to the ends of the earth, and be open to a wide variety of cultures and religions. So I think it's a great combination that he had. Fierce opposition when he had to be fiercely opposed, and then a great openness of heart. The fact that this guy who was almost killed by the Nazis and then was deeply oppressed, almost killed by the communists, yet could stand there and say, "Be not afraid." Where does that come from? That does not come from politics or from psychology or from any worldly thing. That comes from a deep, deep rootedness in prayer. That's what he gave us.
So the next saint is one of powerful witness and intellect. It's Blessed John Henry Newman. I tend to cite Newman as one of our greatest visions of the fact that the church is indeed intellectual. Many might say that atheists might throw out those ideas. And I say, read Newman for 5 minutes and you'll see that the opposite is true. So what impact has Newman had on your life, and why would you encourage our listeners to become very close with him?
Yeah, he did have a big impact on me. I started teaching a course in Newman many years ago at the seminary, and that's when I really read him carefully. That's a little hint, by the way, maybe some teachers out there, is often I would sign up to give a course, and it would compel me to read the person. You know what I'm saying? Because we say, I'll get around to really reading all of Newman someday. Well, what's really going to put the fire under your feet is look, I got to teach a course next September in Newman. So that got me really plowing through all his great books. And once I did, of course, I loved him. From the standpoint of English style, who's better? Name a better writer in English than John Henry Newman. So if you love the English language, and he's one of the truly great intellectual figures who writes in our language. So everybody else, from Augustine to Aquinas to Origen to Bonaventure, anybody, we got to read in translation. Newman we can read in our own language, and it's a great joy to do so. Substantially speaking, he's someone who engaged the modern world in the first great wave of criticism. As modernity began now to come after Christianity, against the Bible, against our key doctrines, Newman entered the lists, he entered the fray. And with tremendous depth and panache, he engaged modernity's critiques. And that, I think, makes him a very important figure. But I'll also turn that around. He saw what was good in modernity. He took elements of modern philosophy and used them in his own articulation of the faith. Finally, I'd say this about Newman. He was a deeply biblical man. Read his sermons. Get the parochial and plain sermon sometime. And again, from a standpoint of English prose, you'll be lifted up. But you'll also realize, man, oh man, does this guy know the Bible? So I think for all those reasons, Newman is of enduring value today.
And I think my favorite work is his Apologia, his autobiography of basically his conversion. And in large part, it's because you really get to know him. You get to see his thinking process. You get to experience the emotions that he's having. I mean, it was not an easy process to go through, and it was something that he really had to carry across all the way through.
We talked about Padre Pro earlier. There's someone that in a very obvious way demonstrates courage. I mean, standing before a firing squad. But Newman, in his own way, demonstrated extraordinary courage because, as you know, at the time, mid-19th century, to go from Anglicanism to Catholicism was to opt out of the society you were living in. And Newman was living in English society at the highest level. So to be an Oxford Don, to be a leader of a national intellectual movement, to have this sparkling career ahead of him, he lost all of that. He gave all that up in becoming a Catholic. Today we say, oh yeah, big deal. We go from Anglicanism to Catholicism. Well, good for you. I'm glad you found your path. We'd say, man, the 19th century, it meant your life was over as you knew it. And Newman did it. He followed what he thought was right, even when it cost him enormously. And that makes him a man of tremendous virtue.
So one thing I've heard you say several times is that we shouldn't just aim to be saints, but aim to be great saints. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, why not? Why settle for mediocrity? Spiritual mediocrities aren't going to change the world. The church's job is to prepare saints, not people that scrape by. Think of a football coach. You got some really, really promising players. Are you happy when they're decent? Yeah, he's a decent running back. Yeah, that guy, he's playing decent quarterback. No, if he's got the ability, he should be a great quarterback. Get onto a great college team. Maybe play in the pros. If you sense talent in someone, of course you want to be great. So the church wants us to be great saints. Now, remember the little flower. It doesn't mean, oh gosh, I guess I got to found an order, or I guess I got to found a university. I guess I got to stand before a firing squad. No, do little things with great love, and you'll be a great saint.
Well, now it's time for our listener question. Remember, if you have a question for Bishop Barron, go to askbishopbarron.com and record your question from any device, and perhaps you'll be featured on one of our upcoming episodes. Today's question comes from Juan in Guatemala, in which he asked advice on how we might deepen our prayer life in light of St. Catherine of Siena's levels of prayer.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Juan Solares from Guatemala in Central America, a vivid example of the new evangelization globalized. I'm watching the Pivotal Player series, and I'm particularly impressed by St. Catherine of Siena's 3 levels in the spiritual life. Boy, would I like to be in level 3. Could you suggest some book or reading material to further my understanding on the subject? Thank you, Bishop Barron. Please keep at it with all your strength. This new evangelization does work.
Muchísimas gracias por esta pregunta. Thank you for that question from Guatemala. I'm glad you like Catherine and the levels of prayer. It's a powerful thing. For those who don't know what we're talking about, she'll use the image of the crucified Jesus. So the first level of discipleship or prayer is the kissing of the feet of the Lord, and that's the stance of repentance. You know, when you come to the Lord and say, Lord, my life has changed. I want to be your slave, your servant. Then there's the kissing, if you want, of the wounded side of Jesus. So now it's the entry into, active discipleship. So I'm going through repentance, and now I'm going to walk the path. I'm going to try to live the life. And then finally, there's the kiss of the mouth of Jesus, and that's an old tradition going back to the Song of Songs. Let him kiss me with a kiss of his mouth. What's that but intimacy with Jesus? So I'm not just in the stance of, repentance. I'm not just a disciple. I'm now a friend of the Lord. Here's my one advice, is you got to go through steps 1 and 2. Is you can't just jump to level 3 and expect to go from abject sinner to intimate friend of Jesus. Is you got to go through this process, of real repentance and then of real discipleship. At the end of that process, you will come to the point, one hopes, of real intimacy. So I would say keep walking the first 2 paths on a regular basis, and you'll find eventually the Lord, see, it's not like the Lord is just kind of dumbly out there and then we have to climb these paths. He's on them with us, see, drawing us through these paths, and he'll draw you into intimacy when the time has come.
Well, thanks so much for tuning into the Word on Fire show. Be sure to check out our website, wordonfireshow.com, for several links regarding the topic we discussed today. Also, I would like to send out a challenge to all of you. Maybe choose a saint from the list we discussed today and take just a week to devote to asking for their intercession for the next 7 days. And as we mentioned, part of this gaining a close relationship with these saints, and you can't gain a friend unless you spend time with them. A great resource for you might be the Praying with the Pivotal Players prayer book, which is for sale at wordonfire.org. And can I ask you a favor? If you're enjoying the show, please go to the Word on Fire Show podcast on iTunes and leave us a review. The more reviews we get, the more people we can reach and draw into the spiritual life. Thanks in advance, and God bless, and we'll see you back here next week on the Word on Fire Show.